read the scripture first, and that is Micah 6, verse 8, short and sweet. Listen here, mortal. God has already made abundantly clear what good is and what Yahweh needs from you. Simply do justice, love kindness, and humbly walk with your God. I am glad to be here, sort of. First thing I want to say is I am not the guest preacher because I'm not a preacher. However, over the years, I've learned some things about telling stories. I want to tell you where I'm coming from on this story, which is the story of my life, not the elevator version, but something between the elevator and enough to put you to sleep, hopefully. And that is, I celebrated 33 years of sobriety on February 10th of this year. Okay. Now, people say to me, aren't you proud of yourself? And I said, no, I'm not. I am so grateful to have had 33 years because it wasn't from me. It was from a lot of other people and from my higher power. And one of the means by which I have stayed sober is because I have been willing to tell my story and listen to other people's stories. And that's why I'm up here today, is to share my story with you. And I'll try to do it in as concise a manner as possible. I wish somebody had read the children's, or given the children's message to me when I was a kid. It might have helped me because I developed a problem-solving model, which I do not recommend to anybody. I will not blame this on the Presbyterian church that I grew up in, but I got the clear message that I wasn't good enough, and it was just a matter of time before God, struck me down. That's not a good message. And as I say, it's not their fault. It's just that's how I incorporated in it because I did not know how to deal with anything less than perfection. My way of dealing with perfection, or with less than perfection, was to concentrate on something else. There's a saying in Charlie Brown, I think he says, there is no problem so big or so complicated that you can't run away from it. That was my problem-solving model. And that it served me fine for a while because I spent most of my youth playing basketball. And I got really good at it to the point where I attracted the attention of an alumni from Dartmouth College who had played on the last West High School team that had won the city championship. And he kind of took interest in me and thought it'd be a great idea if I went to Dartmouth. Now, I had never even heard of Dartmouth, believe it or not, growing up in Minnesota. And but after he introduced me to it, that's where I ended up going. And by the way, we did win the city championship. At Dartmouth, a few notable things happened to me. One is I met my two most faithful drinking buddies who reappear in this story, Hank and Nick. But the other really important event that happened was sometime in the winter of my junior year, I had decided I was going to quit the baseball team. The coach just didn't get me. And this was another problem I could run away from. And so I was down in the bar at SAE fraternity, drowning my sorrows over a keg of beer. And this young woman walks in. She says, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I quit the baseball team today." And I said, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "Well, I'm going out with a guy named John Blair, who turned out to be my roommate the next year. And we had a nice talk, I think. I don't remember a whole lot about the conversation, except that her name was Kathy. Hi, Kathy. That was a pivotal moment for me in my life. Not only did it point me towards Kathy, but it pointed me towards the radio business because instead of concentrating on baseball, I had to do something else besides study, and that was concentrate on being a disc jockey and announcing football games and things like that. So that ended up being my first career, was in the radio business, and it's what got me here. We did a lot of hopping around early in our lives. We had a son, Eric, who just turned 50 this year. He was born 11 weeks premature on May 18th of 1972, and you wouldn't know it by looking at him now. He is a massive man. And then we had Jessica in 1975. She was due on my mother's birthday, October 17th. She ended up a little early. She arrived on September 29th, which is my dad's birthday. And they shared that bond. My life was very successful professionally. I loved doing radio. I just loved doing it. Transferred to ownership and management from being on the air, and I really enjoyed all aspects of it. And I moved to town here. We moved to town in 1980 when we bought WCMF, which I don't know if any of you have ever listened to it, but it's a rock and roll station. It was doing poorly, and through the efforts of a lot of really, really gifted people, we were able to turn it around and make it a success. It's on the air now. It's dominant. Some of the people who we hired are still there, years and years and years later. Joyful experience, except that in the midst of this joy, and this is the way life seems to be sometimes, we got a call one night on July 28th, 1981, from my parents' minister at Westminster Presbyterian in Minneapolis saying my dad had died of a heart attack. Now, my dad was 66 years old. His father had died the same year at 92. I thought my dad was going to live forever. He didn't. And my way of dealing with this was the way I dealt with everything. Do something else and don't worry about it. Don't think about it. Doesn't work so great in a situation like that. It did manage to get me through the next 6 or 7 years where my drinking escalated, my behavior became more and more erratic until my mom contracted a very rare disease, form of cancer, peritoneal cancer, the sac that holds organs. And she was told that this was so rare that there was really no treatment for it. She could try an experimental treatment. She was 75 at the time, or she could put her affairs in order. And she chose the latter. She said, I'll put them in order. And she did. And so I got to spend a little time with her over that summer of 1988. But then when she died in August, that was the end of my coping ability. And I managed to stagger through the next 6 months looking for some solution to that awful hole that I was carrying around inside of me. And I ended up in Minneapolis in February of 1989. I was taking a look at a radio station there, and I figured my two best drinking buddies, Hank and Nick, that would be a really good idea to call them up and have dinner with them and drinks and just like old times, good solution. And so I called them, and I got there first and started early, as I usually did at that stage. And my friend Hank arrived first, and I said, Hank, let me buy you a drink. And Hank says, I gave it up 7 years ago. Really? Okay, fine. I'll wait till Nick gets here, and I'll buy him a drink. Well, Nick arrived a few minutes later. I said, can I buy you a drink, Nick? And he says, quit 11 years ago. Oh, geez. I honestly was so embarrassed by that I didn't have another drink that night or since. But my body was not ready for that. And a week later, I was at a party over at the Wheatmans with Kathy, and it all imploded. And I went into a psychotic episode. I was in the middle of the street in front of the Wheatmans, and I'm looking up into this woman's face who just happened to be a psych nurse named Deb Osterberg, who was also at the party, and she knew what to do with me. And she sent me off to our wing, and I spent a week there. And it was terrifying, absolutely terrifying. And a psychiatrist at the scene picked me up and said, "Listen, if you don't want to be back here again and again and again, you need to not drink anymore." And I said, "Fine, I will not drink anymore." Well, he figured it was just a fluke that I'd had this. 5 weeks later, I was out in Indianapolis, and I had another one. I actually got as far as Cleveland, and then they carted me off to their version of our wing. And after that, I got on some meds that I was diagnosed as bipolar. I got on meds that were keeping me from doing that again. But I just kept doing the rest of the things the same way. And I was on a flight back from Chicago one night, and I was sitting next to a woman, and we got to talking about, I don't know, whatever, life. And I said to her, "Boy, I think alcohol is a problem of mine." And she said, "Well, have you ever thought of AA?" And I said, "No, I'm not sure I'd ever heard of AA." And she said, "Well, I've been in AA for 7 years." And I said, "What do you get from it?" She said, "Serenity." I had not had a drink in 14 months. Was I serene? No, not anywhere even close. And so I decided I would try it. I went to 3 meetings. I went one in Webster, which was far enough away from home that I figured nobody would see me that I knew. I went to East Rochester, where the smoke was hanging so thickly in this room that I said, "I'm not coming back here." And then I went to a Henrietta 530 meeting over across the street from MCC, and I felt like I had come home. And the people there were so nice. They were just a diverse group of people. And a couple weeks after I was there, and I don't know how I got this meeting list that ended up pointing me there, but a couple weeks later, the woman from the airplane showed up. Her name was China Barb. In those days, everybody had a nickname, and hers was China Barb. And of course, I went to total puddle mode, and we hugged each other, and I'd like to say that from then on in, things were great. However, they weren't, because about 6 months later, my psychiatrist, the same one who had talked to me in the first place, decided it would be a good idea to lower my meds. And he did. And I was out in Maine picking up our son Eric from school where he was going, and I had another psychotic break. And this was the longest and worst of the 3 that I had. Eric somehow got me home. A couple of airplane flights. I mean, I have no idea. He was only a 19-year-old kid at the time, but he got me home. And I spent 5 weeks over at our wing. And then after that, my life changed dramatically because my partners of 25 years in the radio business decided that this was not any way to run a business. And so they called me down to Florida, and they said, "We need you to sell out to us." And my reaction at the time was, "How can you do this to me? I've been such a good friend and colleague with you for 25 years. How can you do this?" Well, now I say that's the best favor they ever did, because it allowed me to start over. You have an expression in AA that says you need to change people, places, and things if you want your outcomes to be different. And that was a forced feeding of change that I absolutely needed. I could have spent years doing the same thing, and trying to run fast enough to catch the bus, and I didn't have to do that. I could redefine myself, and part of that redefinition was going back to school, becoming a middle school French teacher, teaching for 13 years out of Churchville Chili Junior High School, middle school, and just redefining my whole life. But the thing that made it possible through this whole thing was AA. The second word in AA is anonymous, but I have chosen to put my anonymity to the side for one big reason, and that is the one thing that I have learned is how important stories are. We're going to have some holes here probably in the next year or two while we're looking for a permanent minister. But I hope that what I have said today and will continue to just finish up with will embolden and empower some of you to share your stories. You all have stories. It's a little daunting sometimes to stand up amongst people that you know and say, oh, what are they going to think of me? Well, I've had 33 years to deal with that issue, but this is the first time I've ever chosen to stand up in front of the church community and tell my story. I just want to talk a couple of things about the program that have something to do with what the scriptures had to say, and that is that the first step in these 12 steps of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, is we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable. The second step is came to believe in a power greater than ourselves and his ability to restore us to sanity. And 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of our higher power as we understood him, or understood God. And that's the basis for the program. This is not a wrestle your alcoholism or your problems to the ground and you're going to be able to solve them. That's not the solution. The solution is admitting that your power ends at a certain point and the rest of it is up to God. We read something at all of our meetings, and it's called How It Works, and the end of it is kind of a paraphrasing of what I just said. How does this whole program work? And they said they have come to 3 pertinent ideas. A, that we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. B, that probably no human power could restore us to sanity. And C, that God could and would if God were sought. And the key word in there, of course, for me is sought, not found. It's nothing to do with finding. It has to do with seeking. Reaching out, listening to others, hearing their stories. It makes one a whole lot more empathetic and compassionate to know that we all have the same emotions, fears, things that, problems that overwhelm us, and that if we admit to them and share them, they are so much more easily solved or diminished, if not solved. I heard a person at one of my meetings this week say, a meeting a day keeps me sane. I can identify with that. I was gone for a week. We went over to Vermont, and, even in a week, I can get squirrely. I just get used to the process of being amongst supportive friends. And it's I don't know if any of you have heard of Brene Brown. Brene Brown has done a marvelous thing. She has taken the spirit and the basis of Alcoholics Anonymous and made it secular. She's made it part of the vernacular. And one of the things she talks about is a belief that I strongly share, and that is, what is spirituality? What is this basis that keeps us all together? And she says, it's recognizing and celebrating that we are all inextricably connected to each other by a power greater than ourselves, and that our connection to the power and to one another is grounded in love and compassion. Practicing spirituality brings a sense of perspective, meaning, and purpose to our lives. Reaching out and touching other people reinforces to me the connectedness of everything. And I'm not just talking about connectedness of people in the program or people in this unbelievably beautiful spot. I'm talking about connectedness with everybody. What happens when we share our stories is we run into those connections, and it reinforces our belief in the higher power, that connection to a spiritual power greater than ourselves. And I want to share one last story of that type of connection, which happened to me about 8 years ago. A woman in the program who I had seen around, didn't know particularly well, but I knew that she had had experience with Al-Anon, sister program for people whose loved ones are alcoholics. And somebody had asked me about, can you tell me any good Al-Anon meetings around? And so I asked her, and she came over to me after one of our AA meetings. She said, here's your list. And I said, thank you so much. And she says, I want to tell you something. You remind me so much of my brother, who died at age 51 of a brain tumor. And I said, what is it about me that reminds you? She says, well, it's not so much you look like him, although you do look like him, but it's kind of like your aura. And I said, well, tell me about him. And she said, well, he went to Dartmouth. And I said, what class was he in? She says, I don't know, late 60s somewhere. And I said, what was he into? And she said, well, he played basketball. I said, really? Okay. Well, what was his name? His name was Les Heath. I said, name didn't ring a bell, but that doesn't mean anything. And so I went home, looked up on the alumni records, and found out that indeed he played freshman basketball on the same team that I did. So I punched up the team photo, the trustee team photo, and which I carry with me, by the way. Here's the trustee team photo. And front row, number 25, Ted Nixon. Right next to him, number 20, Les Heath. We are all connected. Sometimes it's more obvious than others, and sometimes we bump into connections when we least expect them. But our chances are increased dramatically if we tell our stories. Thank you.